The question of how and why the United Nations is the crux of the great conspiracy to destroy the sovereignty of the United States and the enslavement of the American people within a UN own-world dictatorship is a complete and unknown mystery to the vast majority of the American people. The reason for this unawareness of the frightening danger to our country and to the entire free world is simple. The masterminds behind this great conspiracy have absolute control of all of our mass communications media, especially television, the radio, the press, and Hollywood. We all know that our State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House have brazenly proclaimed that they have the right and the power to manage the news, to tell us not the truth but what they want us to believe. They have seized that power on orders from their masters of the great conspiracy, and the objective is to brainwash the people into accepting the phony peace bait to transform the United States into an enslaved unit of the United Nations own world government. First of all, bear in mind that the so-called UN policy action in Korea, fought by the United States, in which 150,000 of our sons were murdered and maimed, was part of the plot, just as the undeclared by Congress war in Vietnam, in which our sons are dying, as part of the plot, just as the plot against Rhodesia in South Africa, in which our sons will be dying, as part of the UN plot. However, the vitally important thing for all Americans, all you mothers of the boys who died in Korea and are now dying in Vietnam, to know is that our so-called leaders in Washington, who we elected to safeguard our nation and our Constitution, are the betrayers, and that behind them are a comparatively small group of men whose solely objective is to enslave the whole world of humanity in their satanic plot of own world government. Now, in order to give you a very clear picture of this satanic plot, I will go back to its beginning, clear back in the middle of the 18th century, and name the men who put that plot into action, and then bring you down to the present today's status of that plot. Now, as a matter of further intelligence, a term used by the FBI, let me clarify the meaning of the expression "he is a liberal." The enemy, meaning the own world conspirators, have seized upon that word liberal as a cover-up for their activities. It sounds so innocent and so humanitarian to be liberal. Well, make sure that the person who calls himself a liberal or is described as a liberal is not, in truth, a red. Now then, this satanic plot was launched back in the 1760s when it first came into existence under the name Illuminati. This Illuminati was organized by one Adam Weishaupt, born a Jew, who was converted to Catholicism and became a Catholic priest, and then, at the behest of the then newly organized House of Rothschild, defected and organized the Illuminati. Naturally, the Rothschilds financed that operation, and every war since then, beginning with the French Revolution, has been promoted by the Illuminati, operating under various names and guises. I say under various names and guises because after the Illuminati was exposed and became notorious, Weishaupt and his co-conspirators began to operate under various other names. In the United States, immediately after World War I, they set up what they called the Council on Foreign Relations, commonly referred to as the CFR, and this CFR is actually the Illuminati in the United States and its hierarchy. The masterminds in control of the original Illuminati conspirators were foreigners, but to conceal that fact, most of them changed their original family names to American-sounding names. Immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, the Illuminati assumed that all the nations were so destitute and so weary of wars that they'd be glad for any solution. So the Rothschild stooges set up what they called the Congress in Vienna, and at that meeting, they tried to create the first League of Nations, their first attempt at own world government, on the theory that all the crowned heads of European governments were so deeply in debt to them that they would willingly or unwillingly serve as their stooges. But the Tsar of Russia caught the stench of the plot and completely torpedoed it. The enraged Nathan Rothschild, then the head of the dynasty, vowed that someday he or his descendants would destroy the Tsar and his entire family. And his descendants did accomplish that very threat in 1917. At this point, bear in mind that the Illuminati was not set up to operate on a short-range basis. Normally a conspirator of any type enters into a conspiracy with the expectation of achieving his objective during his own lifetime, but that was not the case with the Illuminati. True, they hoped to accomplish their objective during their lifetime, but paraphrasing the show must go on. The Illuminati operates on the very long-range basis. Whether it will take scores of years or even centuries, they have dedicated their descendants to keep the pot boiling until they hope the conspiracy is achieved. Now, let's go back to the birth of the Illuminati. Adam Weishaupt was a Jesuit-trained professor of canon law, teaching at Ingolstadt University. When he defected from Christianity to embrace the Luciferian conspiracy, it was in 1770 that the professional money-lenders, the then recently organized House of Rothschild, retained him to revise and modernize the aged protocols of Zionism, which from the outset was designed to give the synagogue of Satan, so named by Jesus Christ, and who are them which say they are Jews and are not. Revelation. Apocalypse 2.9. Ultimate world domination, so they could impose the Luciferian ideology upon what would remain of the human race after the final social cataclysm by use of satanic despotism. Weishaupt completed his task May 1, 1776. Now you know why May 1st is the great day with all communist nations. To this very day, May 1st is also Law Day as declared by the American Bar Association. The celebration of May 1st Beltane goes much further back into history than this, and the day was picked for the ancient reasons, which comes through paganism, Baal worship, and revolves around the worship of Satan. David G. That was the day, May 1st, 1776, that Weishaupt completed his plan and officially organized the Illuminati to put the plan into execution. That plan required the destruction of all existing governments and religions. That objective was to be reached by dividing the masses of people whom he Weishaupt termed Goyism, nationalism, or human cattle into opposing camps in ever-increasing numbers on political, social, economic, and other issues, the very conditions we have in our country today. The opposing sides were then to be armed, and incidents provided which would cause them to fight and weaken themselves and gradually destroy national governments and religious institutions. Again I say, the very conditions in the world today. Now just why did the conspirators choose the word Illuminati for their satanic organization? Weishaupt himself said that the word is derived from Lucifer and means holder of the light, using the lie that his objective was to bring about own world government to enable those with mental ability to govern the world and prevent all wars in the future. In short, using the words peace on earth is his bait, exactly as that same bait as peace was used by the 1945 conspirators to force the United Nations on us. Weishaupt, financed, I repeat, by the Rothschilds, recruited some 2,000 paid followers. These included the most intelligent men in the field of arts and letters, education, the sciences, finance, and industry. He then established lodges of the Grand Orient, Masonic lodges, to be their secret headquarters. And I again repeat, that in all of this he was acting under orders from the House of Rothschild. The main features of the Weishaupt plan of operation required his Illuminati to do the following things to help them to accomplish their purpose: use monetary and sex bribery to obtain control of men already in high places in the various levels of all governments and other fields of endeavor; Once influential persons had fallen for the lies, deceits, and temptations of the Illuminati, they were to be held in bondage by application of political and other forms of blackmail, threats of financial ruin, public exposure, and fiscal harm, even death to themselves and loved members of their families. Do you realize how many present top officials in our present government in Washington are controlled in just that way by the CFR? Do you realize how many homosexuals in our State Department, the Pentagon, all federal agencies, even in the White House, are controlled that way? Illuminati and the faculties of colleges and universities were to cultivate students possessing exceptional mental ability belonging to well-bred families with international leanings and recommend them for special training in internationalism. Such training was to be provided by granting scholarships to those selected by the Illuminatists. That gives you an idea what a Rhodes Scholarship means. It means indoctrination into accepting the idea that only a one-world government can put an end to recurring wars and strife. That's how the United Nations was sold to the American people. One of the most notable Rhodes Scholars we have in our country is Senator William J. Fulbright, sometimes referred to as Half-Bright. His entire voting record spells Illuminati. All influential people trapped into coming under the control of the Illuminati, plus the students who had been specially educated and trained, were to be used as agents and placed behind the scenes of all governments as experts and specialists. So they would advise the top executives to adopt policies which would in the long run serve the secret plans of the Illuminati own world conspiracy and bring about the destruction of the governments and religions they were elected or appointed to serve. Do you know how many such men operate in our government at this very time? Rusk, McNamara, Hubert Humphrey, Fulbright, Kuchel, and goes on and on and on. Perhaps the most vital directive in Weishaupt's plan was to obtain absolute control of the press, at that time the only mass communications media, to distribute information to the public so that all news and information could be slanted, so that the masses could be convinced that own world government is the only solution to our many and varied problems. In 1785, the Bavarian government outlawed the Illuminati and closed the lodges of the Grand Orient. In 1786, they published all the details of the conspiracy. The English title of that publication is The Original Writings of the Order and the Sect of the Illuminati. Copies of the entire conspiracy were sent to all the heads of church and state in Europe. But the power of the Illuminati, which was actually the power of the Rothschilds, was so great that this warning was ignored. Nevertheless, the Illuminati became a dirty word and it went underground. At the same time, Weishaupt ordered Illuminists to infiltrate into the lodges of Blue Masonry and formed their own secret societies within all secret societies. Only Masons who proved themselves internationalists and those whose conduct proved they had defected from God were initiated into the Illuminati. Thenceforth, the conspirators donned the cloak of philanthropy and humanitarianism to conceal their revolutionary and subversive activities. Now here is something that will stun and very likely outrage many who hear this, but there is documentary proof that our own Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton became students of Weishaupt. Jefferson was one of Weishaupt's strongest defenders when he was outlawed by his government, and it was Jefferson who infiltrated the Illuminati into the newly organized lodges of the Scottish Rite in New England. Here is the proof. In 1789, John Robison warned all Masonic leaders in America that the Illuminati had infiltrated into their lodges, and on July 19, 1789, David Papin, president of Harvard University, issued the same warning to the graduating class and lectured them on how the influence of Illuminism was a quitting on American politics and religion, and to top it off, John Quincy Adams, who had organized the New England Masonic Lodges, issued his warnings. He wrote 3 letters to Colonel William L. Stone, a top Mason, in which he exposed how Jefferson was using Masonic lodges for subversive Illuministic purposes. Those 3 letters are at this very time in Wittenberg Square Library in Philadelphia. In short, Jefferson, founder of the Democratic Party, was a member of the Illuminati, which at least partly accounts for the condition of the party. At this time, and through infiltration of the Republican Party, we have exactly nothing of loyal Americanism today. That disastrous rebuff at the Congress of Vienna created by the Tsar of Russia did not by any means destroy the Illuminati conspiracy. It merely forced them to adopt a new strategy, realizing that the own-world idea was, for the moment, killed. The Rothschilds decided that to keep the plot alive they would have to do it by heightening their control of the money system of the European nations. In 1826, one Captain William Morgan decided it was his duty to inform all Masons and the general public what the full proof was regarding the Illuminati, their secret plans, intended objectives, and to reveal the identities of the masterminds of the conspiracy. The Illuminati promptly tried Morgan in absentia and convicted him of treason. They ordered one Richard Howard, an English Illuminist, to carry out their sentence of execution as a traitor. Morgan was warned and he tried to escape to Canada, but Howard caught up with him near the border, near the Niagara Gorge to be exact, where he murdered him. This was verified in a sworn statement made in New York by one Avery Allen to the effect that he heard Howard render his report of the execution to a meeting of Knights Templars in St. John's Hall in New York. He also told how arrangements had been made to ship Howard back to England. That Allen affidavit is on record in New York City archives. Very few Masons and very few of the general public know that general disapproval over that incident of murder caused approximately half of all the Masons in the northern jurisdiction of the United States to secede. Copies of the minutes of the meeting held to discuss that matter are still in existence in safe hands, and that all that secrecy emphasizes the power of the masterminds of the Illuminati to prevent such terrible events of history from being taught in our schools. Weishaupt died in 1830, but prior to his death, he prepared a revised version of the aged conspiracy, the Illuminati, which under various aliases was to organize, finance, direct, and control all international organizations and groups by working their agents into executive positions at the top. In the United States we have Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Jack Kennedy, Johnson, Rusk, McNamara, Fulbright, George Bush, etc., as prime examples. In addition, while Karl Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto under the director of one group of Illuminists, Professor Karl Ritter of Frankfurt University was writing the antithesis under the direction of another group. The idea was that those who direct the overall conspiracy could use the differences in those two so-called ideologies to enable them to divide larger and larger numbers of the human race into opposing camps so that they could be armed and then brainwashed into fighting and destroying each other, and particularly, to destroy all political and religious institutions. The work Ritter started was continued after his death and completed by the German so-called philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, who founded Nietzscheanism. This Nietzscheanism was later developed into fascism and then into Nazism and was used to foment World War I and II. World War II, when and if necessary, was to be fomented by using the controversies between fascists and political Zionists. And here let it be noted that Hitler was financed by Krupp, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, and other internationalist bankers, and that the slaughter of the supposed 6,000 Jews by Hitler didn't bother the Jewish internationalist bankers at all. That slaughter was necessary in order to create worldwide hatred of the German people and thus bring about war against them. In short, this Second World War was to be fought to destroy Nazism and increase the power of political Zionism so that the State of Israel could be established in Palestine. During this World War II, international communism was to be built up until it equaled in strength that of united Christendom. When it reached that point, it was to be contained and kept in check until required for the final social cataclysm. As we know now, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin put that exact policy into effect, and Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and George Bush continued that same exact policy. World War III is to be fomented, using the so-called controversies, by the agents of the Illuminati operating under whatever new name, that are now being stored up between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Muslim world. That war is to be directed in such a manner that all of Islam and political Zionism Israelis will destroy each other, while at the same time, the remaining nations, once more divided on this issue, will be forced to fight themselves into a state of complete exhaustion, physically, mentally, spiritually, and economically. Now can any thinking person doubt that the intrigue now going on in the Near Middle and Far East is designed to accomplish that satanic objective? Pike himself foretold all this in a statement he made to Mazzini on August 15, 1871. Pike stated that after World War III is ended, those who will aspire to undisputed world domination will provoke the greatest social cataclysm the world has ever known. Quoting his own words taken from the letter he wrote to Mazzini, and which letter is now catalogued in the British Museum in London, England, he said, "We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a great social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to all nations the effect of absolute atheism, the origins of savagery and of most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere, the people will be forced to defend themselves against the world minority of the world revolutionaries, and will exterminate those destroyers of civilization and the multitudes disillusioned with Christianity, whose spirits will be from that moment without direction and leadership, and anxious for an ideal, but without knowledge where to send its adoration, will receive the true light through the universe, a manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out into public view, a manifestation which will result from a general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. Thus, at the same time that Schiff and co-conspirators were laying their plans for the entrapment of our money system, they were also perfecting plans to hit the unsuspecting American people with an explosive and terrifying racial upheaval that would tear the people into hate fractions and create chaos throughout the nation, especially on all college and university campuses, all protected by Earl Warren decisions and our so-called leaders in Washington, D.C. Remember the Warren Commission on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Of course, perfecting those plans requires time and infinitely patient organizing. Note: Jack Kennedy, during his term of office as the President of the United States, became a Christian. In his attempt to repent, he tried to inform the people of this nation at least twice that the office of the President of the United States was being manipulated by the Illuminati, CFR. At the same time, he put a stop to the borrowing of Federal Reserve notes from the Federal Reserve Bank and began issuing United States notes, which was interest-free on the credit of the United States. It was the issuing of the United States notes that caused Jack Kennedy to be assassinated. Upon taking the oath of office, Lyndon B. Johnson stopped the issuing of the United States notes and went back to borrowing Federal Reserve Bank notes, which were loaned to the people of the United States at the going rate of interest of 17%. The U.S. notes that were issued under John F. Kennedy were of the 1963 series, which bore a red seal on the face of the note. In 1912, their man, Woodrow Wilson, was elected to the presidency. Immediately after Wilson was inaugurated, Senator Aldrich railroaded the Federal Reserve Act through both houses of Congress, and Wilson promptly signed it, and the Federal Reserve Act became law. That heinous act of treason was committed on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when all the members of Congress, except for several carefully picked representatives and 3 equally carefully picked senators, were away from Washington. How heinous treasonous was that act, I'll tell you. Our founding fathers knew full well the power of money. They knew that whoever had that power held the destiny of our nation in his hands. Therefore, they carefully guarded this power when they set forth in the Constitution that Congress, the elected representatives of the people, alone would have the power. The constitutional language on this point is brief, concise, and specific, stated in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5, defining the duties and powers of Congress, and I quote, "to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and the standard of weights and measures." But on that tragic, unforgettable day of infamy, December 23, 1913, the men we sent to Washington to safeguard our interests, the representatives, senators, and Woodrow Wilson, delivered the destiny of our nation into the hands of 2 aliens from Eastern Europe, Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg. Warburg was a very recent immigrant who came here on orders from Rothschild for the express purpose of blueprinting that foul Federal Reserve Act. Now the vast majority of the American people think that the Federal Reserve System is a United States government-owned agency. That is positively false. The member banks own all of the stock of the Federal Reserve banks, and the heads of the member banks are all members of the hierarchy of the great Illuminati conspiracy known today as the CFR. Well, that too was not an insurmountable problem for our Machiavellian plotters. The same elected leaders in both houses of Congress, and the same Mr. Woodrow Wilson, who signed the infamous Federal Reserve Act into law, amended the Constitution to make the federal income tax, known as the 16th Amendment, a law of the land. Both are illegal under our Constitution. In short, the same traitors signed both betrayals, the Federal Reserve Act and the 16th Amendment, into law. However, it seems that nobody ever realized that the 16th Amendment was set up to rob, and I do mean rob, the people of their earnings via the income tax provision. The membership of the CFR is approximately 1,000 in number and contains the heads of virtually every industrial empire in America, such as Blau, President of the U.S. Steel Corporation, Rockefeller, King of the oil industry, Henry Ford, too, and so on. And of course, all the international bankers. Also, the heads of the tax-free foundations are officers and are active CFR members. In short, all the men who provided the money and the influence to elect the CFR chosen presidents of the United States, the congressmen, the senators, and who decide the appointments of our various secretaries of state, of the Treasury, of every important federal agency, are members of the CFR, and they're very obedient members, indeed. And in 1945, the conspirators finally achieved the United Nations, their new housing for their own world government. And truly amazing, all of the American people hailed this foul outfit as a holy of holies. Even after all the true facts about how the UN was created were revealed, the American people continued to worship that evil outfit. Even after Alger Hess was unmasked as a Soviet spy and traitor, the American people continued to believe in the UN. Even after I had publicly revealed the secret agreement between Hess and Milatosh that a Russian would always be the head of the military secretariat and by that token the real master of the UN. But most of the American people continued to believe that the UN could do no wrong. Even after Trygve, the first Secretary-General of the UN, confirmed that Hess-Milatosh's secret agreement in his book, For the Cause of Peace, Vazhelia was given a leave of absence by the UN, so that he could take command of the North Koreans and Red Chinese who were fighting the so-called UN policy action under our own General MacArthur, who, by orders of the UN, was fired by the pusillanimous President Truman in order to prevent him from winning that war. Our people still believed in the UN despite our 150,000 sons who were murdered and maimed in that war. The people continued to regard the UN as a sure means for peace even after it was revealed in 1951 that the UN, using our own American soldiers under UN command, under the UN flag, in collusion with our traitorous State Department and the Pentagon, had been invading many small cities in California and Texas in order to perfect their plan for the complete takeover of our country. Most of our people brushed it off and continued their belief that the UN is a holy of holies, and surely you know that the UN policy during the Korean and Vietnam Wars was to prevent us from winning those wars. Do you know that all the battle plans of General MacArthur had to go first to the UN, to be relayed to Vazhelia, commander of the North Koreans and Red Chinese, and that any future wars fought by our sons under the UN flag would have to be fought by our sons under the control of the UN Security Council? Do you know that the UN has never done anything about the 80,000 Russian-Mongolian troops that occupy Hungary? Do you know that Adlai Stevenson said, "The free world must expect to lose more and more decisions in the UN"? Do you know that the UN openly proclaims that its chief objective is own world government, which means own world laws, own world court, own world schools, and own world church in which Christianity would be prohibited? Do you know that a UN law has been passed to disarm all American citizens and to transfer all our armed forces to the UN? Such a law was secretly signed by St. Jack Kennedy in 1961. Do you realize how that fits in with Article 47, Paragraph 3, of the UN Charter, which states, and I quote, "The Military Staff Committee of the UN shall be responsible through the Security Council for the strategic direction of all armed forces placed at the disposal of the Security Council, and when and if all our armed forces are transferred to the UN, your sons would be forced to serve and die under the UN command all over the world. This will happen unless you fight to get the US out of the UN." Now do you know that the National Council of Churches passed a resolution in San Francisco, which states that the United States will soon have to subordinate its will to that of the UN, and that all American citizens must be prepared to accept it? Is your church a member of the National Council of Churches? In conclusion, I have this to say: you probably are familiar with the story of how one drive Frankenstein created a monster to do his will of destroying his chosen victims, but how instead, in the end, that monster turned on his own creator, Frankenstein, and destroyed him. Well, the ILLUMINATI CFR has created a monster called the United Nations, who is supported by their minority groups, rioting Negroes, the traitorous mass communications media, and the traitors in Washington, D.C., which was created to destroy the American people. We know all about that many-headed Hydra monster, and we know the names of those who created that monster. We know all their names, and I predict that one fine day the American people will come fully awake and cause that very monster to destroy its creator. True, the majority of our people are still being brainwashed, deceived, and diluted by our traitorous press, TV, and radio, and by our traitors in Washington, D.C. But surely by now enough is known about the UN to stamp out that outfit as a deadly poisonous rattlesnake in our midst. My only wonder is, what will it take to awaken and arouse our people to the full proof? Perhaps this record transcript will do it. 100,000 or 1,000,000 copies of this record, this transcript can do it. I pray to God it will, and I pray that this record transcript will inspire you, all of you, to spread this story to all loyal Americans in your community. You can do it by playing it, reading it to study groups assembled in your homes, at meetings of the American Legion, the VFW, the DAR, all other civic groups and women's clubs, especially the women's clubs who have their sons' lives at stake. With this record transcript I have provided you with the weapon that will destroy the monster. For the love of God, of our country, and of your children, use it. Get a copy of it into every American home. In 1930, Mr. Fagan came to Hollywood, where he served as writer-director with Path Pictures, Inc., then owned by Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the late President Jack Kennedy, and also at 20th Century Fox and other Hollywood film studios. But he also continued in the Broadway legitimate field. In 1945, at the urgent request of John T. Flynn, the famous author of The Roosevelt Myth, While We Slept, The True Story of Pearl Harbor, etc., Mr. Fagan attended a meeting in Washington, D.C., where he was shown a set of microfilms and recordings of the secret meetings at Yalta attended only by Franklin Roosevelt, Alger Hess, Harry Hopkins, Stalin, Molotov, and Vyshinsky when they hatched the plot to deliver the Balkans, Eastern Europe and Berlin to Stalin. As a result of that meeting, Mr. Fagan wrote 2 plays, Red Rainbow, in which he revealed that entire plot, and Thieves' Paradise, in which he revealed how those men plotted to create the United Nations to be the housing for a so-called communist-owned world government. At the same time, Mr. Fagan launched AONDMA and crusade to unmask the Red Conspiracy in Hollywood to produce films that would aid that one world government plot. Out of that came into being the Cinema Educational Guild. As a result of the work of this CEG organization headed by Mr. Fagan, in 1947, came the congressional hearings at which more than 300 of Hollywood's, also radio and TV most famous stars, writers, and directors were unmasked as the chief activist of the Red Conspiracy. That was when the infamous Hollywood 10 were sent to prison. From that time on, Mr. Fagan has devoted all of his time and efforts to writing monthly news bulletins for CEG, in which he has kept up the fight to alert the American people to the plot to destroy the sovereignty of the United States of America and the ensuing enslavement of the American people in a United Nations one world government. A note from Webservant of LoveAthatruth.com. Myron Fagan makes mention at the end of his presentation that the Mormon Church is one of the few that hasn't submitted to the Illuminati, but this is not accurate. Mormonism is rooted in the occult Kabbalah, a Jewish book of occult mysticism which originated from pagan Babylon when the Jews were in captivity for 70 years. Mormonism is straight out of hell and is definitely a part of the New World Order. The Mormon cult was founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith, an occult 33rd-degree Freemason, as was Charles Taze Russell, who founded the Jehovah's Witness cult in 1874. The Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City, Utah, displays the all-seeing eye of Horus above its doors, and Myron Fagan recorded his exposé on the Illuminati and Council on Foreign Relations in the late 1960s on 3LP Records. Here is his lecture in 6 parts representing each side of those records in MP3 audio format.